Before there was a skyline, before a city learned to rush or forget how to sleep, this land already knew how to be quiet. Along a wide river, people lived without urgency, without ambition, and without knowing they were standing beneath a future called New York. If these quiet stories of the past help your breathing slow and your thoughts soften into the night, you are always welcome to remain here. Subscribing gently supports long-form storytelling without noise, urgency, or performance. It helps protect this calm space where history moves at its own pace and speaks in a low voice. Your presence allows more evenings like this to exist, more patience, more stillness, more careful listening. There is no rush. Return whenever the world feels too loud. We will be here, quietly waiting. Before New York existed, a quiet world along the Hudson around 1200 AD. Long before there was a skyline, before there were streets with names, before anyone argued about rent, noise, or how fast the city was changing, there was a stretch of land along a wide, patient river. The river did not know it would one day be called the Hudson. It had no reason to prepare for that. Around the year 1200 AD, this place was not waiting to become anything. It already was. If you stood here then, your feet pressed into soil that had never felt pavement, you would not hear a city breathing. You would hear water moving with no schedule. You would hear insects doing their quiet, necessary work. You would hear wind touching leaves the way it always had. Nothing was rushing. Nothing was late. This was the world of the Lenape. Not a civilization obsessed with building upward or outward, but one deeply interested in staying where it was. The land along the river was not undeveloped. It was fully understood. Paths existed, not because they needed to connect destinations, but because people had walked them many times before. Villages rested where the ground made sense, near fresh water, near forests that could feed and shelter, near soil that could be gently persuaded to grow food. There was no city here, no urban plan, no central authority deciding what belonged where. The Lenape lived in small communities, spread out enough to breathe, close enough to recognize one another. A village might hold a few extended families. Everyone knew who everyone was, which meant reputation mattered more than law. Stories mattered more than orders. Homes were made of wood and bark, long houses that held multiple families together under one roof, not because space was scarce, but because warmth, cooperation, and conversation mattered. Smoke drifted upward and out through openings above, carrying with it the smells of cooking and life. At night, the darkness was not something to be defeated. It was simply the other half of the day. The rhythm of life here followed the seasons with no complaint. Spring meant planting. Summer meant growth. Autumn meant preparation. Winter meant slowing down. There was no sense that time was something to conquer. Time was something you moved with, like the river itself. And if this sounds peaceful, that is because it was mostly meant to be. Not perfect, not free of conflict or hardship, but calm in a way that did not need to announce itself. Around 1200 AD, there was no idea that this place would one day be famous. No one stood by the river imagining monuments or financial districts. The land was not dreaming of progress. It was simply being used carefully and returned to itself again and again. Food came from a balance of farming, hunting, and gathering. Corn, beans, and squash grew together in a quiet partnership. Fish moved through the river in predictable cycles, Forests provided game, wood, and medicine. The Lenape understood that taking too much was not a clever strategy. The land remembered things like that. There were no permanent scars carved into the earth. Fires were controlled. Fields were rotated. Villages could shift if the land asked for rest. Nothing here assumed permanence, which is perhaps the most radical difference from the city that would eventually rise on top of it. At night, the sky was wide and honest. No artificial glow, no distant hum, just stars doing what they had always done. People slept when they were tired, woke when light returned. No bells, no clocks, no sense that productivity was a moral obligation. If there was humor, it lived in stories. Stories told by firelight, retold with small changes, softened edges, gentle exaggerations. Stories were not meant to impress strangers. They were meant to remind listeners who they were and where they belonged. History, in the way we usually mean it, had very little interest in this place. There were no empires rising or falling here, no grand wars shaping borders that would be drawn on maps centuries later, which is exactly why this world lasted as long as it did. The Lenape did not need to justify their existence with monuments. They did not build to be remembered. They built to live comfortably, and then to disappear quietly, back into the land when it was time. The forest did not need plaques to know who had been there. From the perspective of later centuries, this might look like the beginning of a story, a prelude, a blank page waiting for ink. But that would be unfair. This was not an empty stage. It was a complete performance happening every day, whether anyone was watching or not. The river flowed south. The seasons returned on schedule. Children learned where not to step. Elders remembered winters that were harsher than this one. Life continued without urgency. If you linger here long enough, you might notice how little effort it takes to exist when nothing is trying to grow endlessly. There is work, yes, but it does not chase you into exhaustion. There is rest and no guilt attached to it. The idea that land should produce more each year than the last had not arrived yet. The idea that growth was a requirement had not crossed the ocean. Around 1200 AD, this place had no idea it would someday be measured in square footage and price per foot. And then, slowly, very slowly, the outside world began to drift closer. At first, nothing changed. A distant ship sighted far from shore. A rumor passed along trading routes that connected peoples long before Europeans imagined they were discovering anything. The Lenape continued living as they always had. The river did not speed up. Centuries would pass before the land truly felt different, before the quiet balance here began to strain, before names were imposed, before ownership replaced relationship. But around 1200 AD, all of that still lay far ahead, too far away to matter, too far away to disturb sleep. This was a place that did not need to be important, and because of that, it was stable. There is a temptation when telling stories like this to foreshadow what comes next, to hint at skyscrapers and steel and crowds that never sleep. But that would break the mood. That future was not inevitable to anyone living here. It was not written into the soil. Instead, imagine an evening by the river, the light lowering itself gently, smoke thinning as fires settle, voices growing quieter not because they must, but because there is nothing urgent left to say. The forest holds its breath in the way forests do at night. The water keeps moving. Somewhere an owl calls out. not for poetry, but because that is simply what owls do. No one is planning a city. No one is late. No one is counting years. This is not New York. This is the ground beneath it, living a full life of its own. And perhaps that is the quiet irony worth holding on to as you drift closer to sleep. The most famous city in the modern world would rise here one day, but only after centuries of calm, unremarkable nights like this one. Nights that asked for nothing. Nights that did not want to be remembered. If history has a sense of humor, it might be here, in the fact that the loudest place imaginable began as one of the quietest, that before the clocks, before the lights, before the ambition, there was simply a river, a forest, and people who knew when to stop for the night. And that, for now, is enough. Rest here a moment longer. The city has not arrived yet. Before New York learned how to speak loudly, it learned how to listen. The land did not announce itself as important. It did not ask to be measured, divided, or named. It simply existed, stretching along a wide river that moved at its own pace, carrying reflections instead of ambition. Long before streets were drawn and buildings competed for height, this place already had a rhythm. It just wasn't a rhythm built for crowds. Around the year 1200 AD, there was no city here, no harbor filled with ships, no skyline rehearsing its future silhouette. What existed instead was something far less dramatic and far more stable, a lived-in landscape, forests that knew where footsteps would fall, water that knew when people would come to fish, clearings that returned each year to the same quiet purposes. This was not a world waiting to become something else. It was complete on its own terms. The people who lived here did not think of themselves as living before anything. They did not imagine a future rushing toward them. Their days were not chapters leading to a climax. Life moved forward, yes, but gently, season by season, without the pressure to accelerate. The Lenape understood time not as a line pulling them ahead, but as a circle they kept stepping into again and again. Morning came with light, not alarms. Work followed necessity, not schedules. Food was gathered, grown, prepared, and shared, without the idea that more was always better. There were stories, but they were not meant to impress strangers. They were meant to settle children, to remind adults where they stood, to smooth over the small frictions that arise when people live close enough to know one another well. This landscape did not reward speed, it rewarded attention, knowing when to plant, knowing when to stop fishing, knowing which parts of the forest needed rest. The land was not something to conquer, it was something to remain in conversation with. At night, darkness arrived without resistance. Fires were small and intentional. The sky opened fully, unfiltered by glass or light. Sleep was not postponed, it was welcomed. No one needed to prove endurance by staying awake longer than necessary. From the perspective of modern history, this calm can feel almost invisible. There are no monuments left behind to argue for its importance. No walls, no towers, no records written to be archived. And yet this quiet endurance shaped the ground more thoroughly than any future construction ever would. As we begin this story, it is important to resist the urge to rush ahead, to resist imagining bridges, avenues, and steel rising immediately out of the soil. None of that belongs here yet. This is not the beginning of a city. It is the end of a day, repeated for generations. What follows is not a tale of invention or expansion. It is a reminder that before New York became a place defined by motion, it was defined by stillness. And to understand what the city eventually became, we must first stay here, just a little longer, in the quiet that came before it knew how to disappear. When the world first looked this way, the 16th century. In the 16th century, nothing here asked to be discovered. The river still moved as it always had, wide and unhurried, reflecting clouds that did not know they would one day be described in travel journals. The forests did not rearrange themselves in anticipation. The shoreline did not practice becoming a harbor. The land along the Great Bay simply continued being land, held together by roots, water, and long familiarity said aloud only in memory. And yet, far out at sea, the world was beginning to look. In 1524, a European ship slid into unfamiliar waters, its sails catching the same wind that bent the grasses along the shore. A man stood on its deck, trained to see coastlines not as homes but as outlines. His name was Giovanni da Verrazzano, and he had been sent not to stay, not to listen, but to notice. From his perspective, this was not a living place. It was a promising shape. The bay opened before him, wide and calm, its entrance generous, almost welcoming. He did not know the depth of the water or the habits of the tides. He did not know the paths that led inland or the stories tied to each bend of the river. He saw instead what sailors were trained to see: shelter, access, potential, a place that could be written down. Verrazzano did not step ashore. He did not build. He did not claim. He observed. He described. He did what Europe had learned to do well by this point in history. He translated land into words that could travel farther than he ever would. And with that, something subtle but irreversible began. For the people already living here, nothing changed that day. The Lenape did not feel a shift in the ground. Children still learned where the water grew shallow. Fires were lit in familiar places. The seasons continued their dependable turn. If anyone noticed the ship at all, it was as a curiosity, a moving shape that did not belong to the river's usual vocabulary. The land did not yet know it had been seen. But elsewhere, far from this quiet shoreline, maps were beginning to change. To European eyes, the 16th century was an age of edges. The known world pressed outward, not because it had run out of space, but because it had run out of patience. Coastlines became invitations. Rivers became questions. Every bay hinted at a route. Every opening suggested opportunity. When Verrazzano recorded his impressions, he did not describe a homeland. He described a possibility. A very pleasant situation, he wrote. A place that appeared suitable for settlement, for ships, for future use. He could not help it. His language carried assumptions as naturally as the ship carried him. And so the land was named from afar. Not named in the way the Lenape named places with meaning rooted in use and memory, but named as an entry, a notation, a line on parchment that said, in effect, this exists, and therefore it can be considered. This was not conquest, not yet. This was something quieter, and perhaps more dangerous in the long run. The land had entered global awareness without being consulted. From this moment on, the bay was no longer only itself. It was also an idea circulating in ports and courts across the Atlantic. Sailors spoke of it. Cartographers traced it. Investors imagined it. The place began living a second life entirely separate from the one unfolding on its shores. And still on the ground, everything remained calm. The Lenape continued their patterns, unaware that their home had been folded into a larger story that did not yet include them as characters. They were not discovered, they were simply not mentioned. The land, too, was present but untranslated, its complexity flattened into shoreline sketches and approximate distances. This is how global history often begins, not with an invasion, but with attention. Ships came and went over the following decades, not in great numbers, not with urgency. Explorers followed coastlines the way readers follow sentences, scanning for meaning, skipping what seemed familiar, lingering on what felt new. No permanent European presence yet disturbed the balance here. The Lenape world continued intact, not frozen in time, but living at its own speed. From Europe, however, the tempo was accelerating. The 16th century was restless. Kingdoms competed not only for land, but for information. To be first was to be relevant. To know was to possess, at least in theory. And so, even without settlement, this place had begun its long transition from lived landscape to global asset. Maps now showed the bay. Not accurately, not precisely, but enough. Enough to ensure it would be returned to. It is worth pausing here just briefly to notice how quiet this turning point really was. No battle marked it, no treaty announced it, no buildings rose to commemorate it. A man looked, he wrote, others read, and the land became part of a conversation that would eventually speak over it. There is a faint irony in this, gentle enough to smile at without bitterness. The future city that would never stop talking entered history in silence. For decades after Verrazzano's voyage, the Lenape world remained largely undisturbed. Europeans were visitors, not neighbors. The river was still used for fishing, not commerce. Forests still grew without regard for timber markets. Villages shifted when needed. Life remained adaptable, light on the land. Yet the idea of the place was growing heavier. By the late 16th century, European powers were no longer simply curious. They were strategic. Knowledge accumulated earlier was now being reconsidered, reevaluated, compared. Bays were ranked, rivers assessed, harbors judged by depth and defensibility. The land had not changed. The way it was being thought about had. And that difference mattered, because from this point forward, the place would exist in two forms at once. The lived-in world of the Lenape, steady and relational, and the imagined world of Europe, abstract and ambitious. These two versions occupied the same space without touching, like overlapping transparencies waiting for pressure to force them together. It is tempting, knowing what comes later, to read tension into every moment. But that would be unfair to the people living here in the 16th century. They did not live in anticipation of loss. They lived in continuity. The land still responded when asked. The river still provided. The forest still offered shelter and food. The night sky had not changed. If you imagine an evening along the bay during this time, it would feel much like it had centuries earlier. Smoke thinning as fires settled, the sound of water moving in the dark, conversations lowering in volume, not out of fear, but because the day had reached its natural close. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships might be charting future routes. Somewhere in Europe, Ink was drying on paper that carried this place's outline. But here the ground remained untroubled by those intentions. This chapter of the story is not dramatic. That is precisely why it matters. History often prefers moments of impact, of collision, of undeniable change. But the 16th century along the future shores of New York was defined by something else entirely. It was defined by the act of being noticed without being altered, of being named without being taken, of standing at the edge of global awareness while still belonging entirely to itself. The land did not yet know it was becoming important, and importance, as it turns out, is rarely a gift. For now, though, it was only a glance, a line in a logbook, a shape on a map. The Lenape world continued breathing, unaware that it had been quietly enrolled in a much louder future. And that is where this chapter rests, not at the moment of conquest, not even at the moment of contact, but at the softer, stranger moment when the world first looked this way, and the land, patient as ever, did not look back. If you listen closely enough, you can almost hear the irony settling in with the night air. The greatest city of the modern age was still only a rumor, drifting across the ocean, while the place itself slept peacefully, unconcerned, and beautifully unprepared. Long before anyone thought to ask what this place might become, it already knew how to exist without instruction. The water along the wide bay moved with a patience that never needed reinforcement, arriving and withdrawing not on command but on memory. The forests behind the shore stood without clearing their throats, without presenting themselves as obstacles or resources, simply growing because the soil allowed it and the seasons returned as promised. Nothing here behaved as if it were temporary. Nothing acted as though it were early in a story. This land was not waiting to be discovered. That idea would have felt strange here, almost impolite. Waiting implies expectation, and expectation requires imagination aimed forward. The rhythms along the river pointed sideways instead, circling back on themselves year after year, comfortable with repetition. Spring returned because it always had. Winter arrived without needing justification. People did not mark time by counting how much had passed, but by recognizing when something familiar came back again. The absence of urgency shaped everything. Paths existed because they had been walked before, not because they were planned. Villages appeared where the land offered shelter and water without resistance. There was no interest in permanence for its own sake. Structures were built to serve life, not to outlast it. If a place needed rest, it was given rest. If the land asked for space, people shifted without resentment. From the outside, this might later be described as simplicity. From the inside, it was precision. Knowing when not to take mattered more than knowing how to take. The land responded best to restraint, and that lesson had been learned slowly, without anyone writing it down. At night, darkness arrived fully, without apology. There were no lights attempting to compete with it, no reason to stretch the day longer than it wished to last. Fires were small, intentional, and allowed to fade. The sky opened wide, offering stars without commentary. Sleep was not something to be earned. It was simply part of the cycle, arriving as naturally as evening itself. Nothing here suggested that it would one day carry weight in someone else's imagination. The land was busy enough being itself. The Lenape world lived from the inside. The people who lived here did not see the land as a backdrop. It was not scenery. It was a participant. The Lenape moved within a relationship rather than across territory, and that distinction shaped everything that followed. Villages were small, never attempting to grow beyond recognition. Everyone knew everyone else, which meant behavior carried memory. There were no written laws because there was no anonymity to hide behind. Homes were built for sharing. Longhouses held extended families together, not because space was scarce, but because warmth, conversation, and cooperation mattered. Smoke drifted upward through openings above, carrying the smell of cooking and daily life rather than ambition. These were not structures meant to dominate the landscape. They rested within it, easily repaired, easily replaced, never assuming they had the right to remain forever. Food came from balance. Corn, beans, and squash grew together, each compensating for the others. Fishing followed cycles learned over generations. Hunting respected absence as much as presence. The forest was not a storehouse to be emptied, but a partner that remembered how it had been treated. Too much taken in one season meant less trust the next. Time here did not feel scarce. Work existed, but it did not chase people into exhaustion. There was effort, followed by rest, followed by repetition. Stories filled the spaces between tasks, passed along not to impress, but to remind. Humor lived comfortably inside these stories, small exaggerations and gentle teasing that made the weight of memory easier to carry. Conflict existed, of course, but it did not escalate into spectacle. Problems were addressed because they had to be, not because they could be dramatized. Life was not arranged around constant alertness. It was arranged around continuity. From this position inside the world, nothing felt incomplete. There was no sense that something larger needed to arrive. 1524. A look from far away. When the first European ship entered the bay in 1524, it did not arrive with noise. It did not announce itself to the land. It drifted into view quietly, its sails catching the same wind that bent the grasses along the shore. From its deck, the coastline appeared calm, generous, almost cooperative. To the man observing it, this felt promising. Giovanni da Verrazzano did not step onto the land. He did not test the soil with his hands. He did not wait long enough to notice how the light shifted at different hours. He looked and he recorded. That was his task. The bay became a description. The land became a paragraph. From his perspective, this was not a lived place. It was an outline, a shape that could be transferred onto paper and carried away. He noted shelter, depth, access. He did not note memory. He could not. That kind of knowledge requires staying. For the people on shore, the ship did not alter the day. If it was noticed at all, it was as a curiosity, something passing through without intention. The rhythms of life did not pause. Fires were lit where they always had been. The river continued its work. But elsewhere, far beyond the horizon, the land had entered a new state. It had been seen, and therefore, it could be imagined. Once written down, it no longer belonged only to those who lived within it. It began a second life, quieter at first, circulating through letters, maps, and conversations among people who would never sleep beside its water. Nothing had been taken yet, and yet something had shifted. When a place becomes an idea, the 16th century passed without invasion, without settlement, without visible disruption, and still the land changed in a way that could not be seen from the ground. Its image traveled. Its name, imperfect and provisional, was practiced in unfamiliar mouths. The bay became something to be discussed, compared, evaluated. Maps improved slowly, but confidence grew quickly. Coastlines gained sharper edges. Rivers were extended further inland than anyone had actually traveled. Possibility filled in the blanks. The place became easier to talk about than to understand. Meanwhile, life along the shore continued as it always had. Fishing grounds were reused. Villages shifted when needed. The land remained responsive because it was still being treated as such. The Lenape did not know that elsewhere their home was being folded into larger plans. They were not resisting change. They were simply unaware of it. This was the quiet danger of attention. It did not announce itself as threat. It arrived as interest, curiosity, admiration even. And admiration, when detached from relationship, tends to drift toward entitlement. The land existed now in two forms, one real, breathing, seasonal, one imagined, strategic, abstract. These two versions overlapped without touching, like transparent layers waiting for pressure. For now, the balance held, a century that almost passed unnoticed. As the century continued, ships came and went, never staying long enough to demand rearrangement. Encounters were brief. The Lenape world absorbed them without bending. Life remained adaptive rather than defensive. From Europe, however, the tempo increased. Exploration gave way to comparison. Comparison led to preference. Preference slowly became intent. The land's imagined value grew heavier with each retelling. And still here, evenings arrived quietly. The sky darkened without resistance. People slept without suspicion. No one stood watch over the future. History, as it would later be written, might glance quickly over this period, eager to reach moments of collision. But this century mattered precisely because it delayed those collisions. It was a moment when a place had entered global awareness without being altered, when calm and anticipation existed side by side without yet disturbing one another. The land did not yet know it was becoming important. And importance, as it turns out, rarely arrives gently. By the end of the 16th century, the question was no longer whether the world beyond would return, but when. The land remained unchanged, but its second life had grown louder elsewhere. Conversations carried expectations. Plans waited patiently for opportunity. Here, though, nothing felt unfinished. The Lenape continued living within a world that still worked. The river still answered. The forest still provided. The night still arrived without commentary. This chapter ends not with arrival, but with suspension. A place fully alive, fully occupied, fully itself, resting at the edge of someone else's imagination. The future had not yet crossed the water. It lingered offshore, uninvited, gathering its language. And for now, that was enough. When the land learned a new name, 1624. Nothing about the shoreline announced that it was ready to become a city. The water still arrived and withdrew without instruction. The forest still leaned toward the river, the way it always had. Not anticipating docks or warehouses, not clearing its throat for ships. If you stood here in 1624, you would not feel like you were witnessing the birth of anything important. You would feel, instead, a small adjustment, a slight tightening of the air, the sense that something practical had begun to settle in. This was the moment when New Amsterdam appeared, not with grandeur, but with paperwork. The people who arrived were not dreamers in search of destiny. They were employees, traders, administrators, men who measured value in cargo weight and contract terms rather than sunsets or seasons. They did not come to admire the land, they came to use it carefully, efficiently, and profitably. The ambition was modest, by later standards, which is perhaps why it worked. New Amsterdam began as a fur trading post, and it behaved like one. A small collection of buildings clustered near the southern tip of the island, close enough to the water to make unloading easier, far enough from the forest to feel manageable. There was no skyline, no central square, no vision for what this place might someday become. There was simply a need to store goods, record transactions, and keep track of who owed what to whom. The city, if it could be called that, was quiet in a different way than the land had been before. Not empty, not peaceful, just restrained. The population was small, not even reaching a few thousand people, and most of them knew exactly why they were there. This was not a place to get lost in. It was a place to work. The streets were narrow, irregular, and entirely unimpressed with symmetry. They followed convenience rather than design, bending around structures that had been built first and planned later. Mud was common. Silence was not. The sounds here were practical ones. Crates shifting, voices negotiating, boots scraping against earth that was no longer allowed to rest. This was the first moment when the land encountered something new. Not exploration, not attention, but structure. Roads appeared, not because they were beautiful, but because things needed to move from one place to another without argument. Docks extended into the water, claiming small sections of the shoreline and teaching the river how to behave near schedules. Laws followed quickly, written down, and enforced not out of moral urgency, but because disagreement was bad for business. Money arrived quietly and stayed. Coins changed hands, ledgers filled. Value began to detach itself from immediate usefulness and attach instead to exchange. A pelt became a unit became profit. Profit justified presence. Presence required permanence. This was not conquest, it was accounting. For the Lenape, this shift did not arrive as an explosion, it arrived as a narrowing. Space that had once been flexible became fixed. Paths that had once been shared acquired boundaries. Agreements that had once been spoken now appeared on paper, in languages that did not translate well into lived reality. And yet, even here, the early years were marked more by coexistence than conflict. Trade continued, interaction persisted. The land did not immediately reject this new arrangement. It absorbed it cautiously, the way it absorbed everything else. New Amsterdam was not impressive. That is important to remember. It did not imagine itself as permanent. It did not speak of destiny. It existed because it was useful, and usefulness was the only justification it required. The city slept early. There was no nightlife to speak of. Darkness still had authority. Fires dimmed, doors closed. People rested because there was work to do in the morning, and exhaustion was inefficient. Religion existed, but it did not dominate the soundscape. Faith was practiced privately, tucked between tasks, not announced into the streets. This was a working settlement, not a sermon. If you walked its length, you would not need much time. A handful of streets, a modest fort, warehouses smelling of animal skins and salt air, houses built close together not for intimacy but for convenience. This was the first valid moment to call this place a city, though it would have felt almost embarrassing to do so out loud. It had roads, yes. It had docks. It had laws and money and schedules, but it lacked confidence. It was a city that knew it was temporary, even if it did not yet know how long it would last. What made New Amsterdam different from everything that had come before was not size or ambition, but insistence. The structures here expected to remain. The rules assumed continuity. The land was no longer allowed to forget what had happened yesterday. Time changed shape. Days became units. Work became hours. Movement became something to be regulated. The river was still the river, but now it had appointments. The forest still stood, but it was watched more closely. Everything became slightly less forgiving. And yet, compared to what would follow centuries later, this city was almost gentle. It did not demand speed. It did not punish slowness. It simply introduced repetition of a different kind. A routine not shaped by seasons, but by trade. The irony, soft enough to smile at, is that New Amsterdam was founded by people who had no interest in greatness. They wanted stability, profit, and a reliable return on investment. They did not build monuments. They built storage. And storage, quietly, changes everything. As the years passed, more people arrived. Not enough to overwhelm, but enough to reinforce the idea that this place was not going away. The settlement gained a rhythm that did not depend on weather. Ships arrived when they were scheduled to arrive. Goods moved regardless of season. The land began to learn a new language, one spoken in contracts and measurements. Still, the nights remained relatively quiet. The sky had not yet been stolen by light. Stars were still visible above the small cluster of roofs. Sleep came without resistance. This was a city learning how to exist without spectacle. It did not yet imagine itself as a center. It was an outpost, a tool, a hinge between worlds. Its power lay not in what it produced, but in what it moved. And for now, that was enough. New Amsterdam rested at the edge of the continent, small, deliberate, slightly unsure of itself, surrounded by land that remembered a different rhythm and water that did not care what it was called. This chapter does not end with expansion or conflict. It ends with establishment. A place where paths hardened into roads, where exchange replaced gift, where the idea of permanence began to outweigh the comfort of change. For the first time, the land carried a city, not because it had been imagined from afar, but because it was being used every day. This was not the birth of a metropolis. It was the birth of habit. And habits once formed are far more difficult to move than people ever expect. What made New Amsterdam quietly different was not ambition, but routine, because once people begin repeating the same actions in the same place day after day, something resembling a city starts to appear, even if no one ever announces it out loud. And here, those repetitions were small and practical, almost modest, involving the opening of shutters at roughly the same hour each morning, the checking of ledgers before voices were raised, the unloading of goods with a familiarity that suggested expectation rather than surprise, as if everyone involved already assumed that tomorrow would look more or less like today, which in itself was a radical idea on a continent where so much still felt provisional. The settlement learned to recognize itself through habit. Paths hardened into streets, not because they were declared so, but because feet chose them again and again, avoiding puddles, skirting storage sheds, passing by the same doors, until memory replaced intention. These streets were narrow and imperfect, bending slightly, as if still unsure how permanent they were allowed to be. and no one complained about their lack of order because order at this stage was simply anything that worked. The docks became the settlement's most reliable heartbeat. Ships arrived carrying news that was already old by the time it reached shore, cargo whose value depended entirely on distance, and people who did not intend to stay long enough to learn the land's moods. When ships left, they took with them more than goods. They carried the idea that this place mattered just enough to return to, and that was sufficient motivation for it to continue existing. Money, once introduced, began quietly rearranging relationships. Exchange became less personal, more precise. Debts were written down instead of remembered. Trust shifted from faces to documents. None of this felt dramatic at the time. In fact, it felt efficient, which is often how the most consequential changes arrive. The settlement did not argue about these adjustments. It accepted them the way it accepted weather, as conditions to be navigated rather than resisted. Law followed money, not morality. Rules were established to reduce friction, not to inspire virtue. Disputes were settled with an eye toward continuity rather than justice in any abstract sense, because what mattered most was that trade continue uninterrupted. This was not cruelty. It was pragmatism, which is gentler on the surface but far more durable. The Lenape presence did not vanish overnight. Interaction continued, layered with misunderstanding and negotiation. Trade created moments of cooperation, even familiarity, though always within an imbalance that slowly widened. The settlement did not yet see itself as replacing anything. It believed it was merely adding itself to the landscape, unaware that addition over time becomes displacement, even when no one intends it to. New Amsterdam remained small enough that silence still existed between buildings. At night, the settlement dimmed quickly. There were no reasons to stay awake late, no entertainments designed to stretch the day beyond necessity. People slept because rest improved efficiency, and efficiency was already becoming a shared value, though no one had named it yet. Religion, when practiced, did not spill loudly into public space. Belief was personal, tucked between tasks, folded into daily routines rather than imposed upon them. This was not a city interested in conversion. It was interested in contracts. Faith was allowed so long as it did not interfere with schedules. Children grew up learning the shape of a place that did not yet feel crowded. They knew where the docks ended and the forest began. They understood which areas were watched and which were still flexible. Their sense of space was already different from that of the people who had lived here before, because permanence was beginning to settle into the ground beneath their feet, even if it did not yet feel heavy. What is striking about this phase of the city's life is how little it resembled what it would later become. There was no urgency to grow, no hunger for dominance. The settlement did not dream beyond its immediate usefulness. It existed in a kind of practical present, focused on maintenance rather than expansion. And yet maintenance is how cities survive. By continuing to function without collapsing, New Amsterdam proved something quietly important. It showed that a European-style settlement could persist here without constant reinforcement, that goods could move reliably, that laws could be enforced, that money could circulate. These small proofs accumulated, building confidence far more effectively than any declaration ever could. The land adjusted slowly. The river accepted docks without complaint. The shoreline learned new shapes. Trees fell selectively, not yet in great numbers, but enough to signal intention. Space began to acquire edges that did not move. This was still a city you could walk across without effort. still a place where most faces were familiar, still a settlement that would not have impressed anyone expecting grandeur. But it had crossed an invisible threshold. It had learned how to repeat itself. And repetition, more than vision, is what allows a city to take root. New Amsterdam did not yet know it was laying foundations for something larger. It was simply doing what it needed to do to remain useful, stable, and predictable. That was enough to ensure it would be difficult to remove. The land, once fluid, was beginning to remember where things had been placed. And memory, when shared by structures and schedules, becomes the earliest form of permanence. What this place did not yet understand was that by choosing steadiness over spectacle, it was becoming difficult to undo, because a settlement does not need ambition to survive, only repetition, and here repetition had already begun to settle into the ground through small, practical acts that no one thought of as historic. The opening of shutters at the same hour, the steady keeping of records, the quiet repair of docks. After use rather than after disaster, all of it building confidence not as excitement, but as expectation, until remaining felt easier than leaving and staying felt less like a decision than a habit. The land adjusted without protest. Paths remembered where feet preferred to go. The shoreline learned the pressure of wood and rope. The forest grew thinner in familiar places, not abruptly, but predictably. The way change often arrives when it expects to be accommodated. These shifts did not announce loss, only rearrangement, yet they carried weight that would be felt much later, long after they had stopped being noticeable. For those who had lived here before, the world had not disappeared, but it had tightened. Movement now involved explanation. Access came with conditions. Familiar spaces began to feel watched, managed, accounted for. None of this arrived in a single moment that could be named. It arrived slowly, accumulating the way weather does, until the air felt different, without anyone remembering when it changed. The settlement itself remained small and quiet. Nights were still dark. Silence still existed between buildings. People slept early not because they were weary of the place, but because there was no need to stretch the day longer than necessary. Tomorrow would resemble today, and that resemblance felt reassuring. The land still held the river and the trees, but it also held something new now, a memory of structures that expected to remain, of rules that assumed continuity, of routines that no longer asked permission to repeat themselves. The place had learned a new name, and more importantly, it had learned how to answer to it. Nothing dramatic closed this moment. No turning point demanded attention. The water kept moving, lamps dimmed, doors closed, and the city, still small enough to overlook itself, settled into sleep beside a river that had seen many arrangements before, unaware that this one, unlike the others, had begun to stay. When a settlement learned to repeat itself, 1624. When the first permanent European settlement took shape at the southern edge of the island in 1624, nothing about it felt like a beginning anyone would later celebrate, because what was happening here was not the founding of a city in any ceremonial sense, but the quiet decision to stay long enough that leaving would become inconvenient, and that decision, modest as it seemed, changed the land more thoroughly than any declaration ever could. At first, this place did not even insist on being called a city. It behaved more like a working arrangement that had overstayed its temporary status. A handful of buildings clustered close to the water, not out of aesthetic preference, but because carrying cargo by hand is exhausting when distances grow imaginative. Proximity was not symbolism, it was survival, and survival, repeated often enough, begins to resemble permanence. The people who arrived here did not speak in the language of destiny. They spoke in ledgers, they spoke in quantities and delivery schedules, they spoke in contracts that assumed tomorrow would exist and look enough like today to be predictable. This was the Dutch way of settling, practical to the point of humility, uninterested in grandeur, deeply invested in function. If something did not help goods move, records remain legible, or disputes stay manageable, it was unnecessary. Only after this routine had settled did the name New Amsterdam begin to circulate with confidence, not as a dream, but as a label of convenience, a way to mark a place that had become reliable enough to be mentioned without explanation. The name followed the behavior, not the other way around. The settlement remained small, almost embarrassingly so by later standards. Fewer than a few thousand people lived here, and most of them knew exactly why they were present. This was not a destination meant to shape identity. It was a point of exchange, a hinge between water and land, a place you passed through, worked within, and then left behind without ceremony. Streets did not appear because someone planned them. They appeared because feet are stubborn. Paths formed where people preferred not to sink into mud, where crates were easier to drag, where doors had already been opened often enough to justify another visit. These streets bent without apology, indifferent to symmetry, uninterested in looking intentional. Order emerged not from design, but from repetition. Docks followed the same logic. Wood extended into the water not to impress the river, but to make unloading tolerable. Ropes pulled in the same places day after day. The shoreline stiffened where it was asked to hold weight repeatedly. None of this felt dramatic. It felt reasonable. And reasonable changes are the hardest to argue against while they are happening. Law arrived without philosophy. It came as soon as disagreement began interfering with trade. Rules were written down not to perfect behavior, but to reduce friction. Justice was functional, not moral. The goal was not fairness in the abstract, but continuity. Keep things moving, keep things predictable, keep things quiet enough to work. Money followed naturally. Coins circulated. Value detached itself from use and attached itself to exchange. A fur mattered less because it kept someone warm, and more because it could be traded for something else, somewhere else. This did not feel revolutionary at the time. It felt efficient. Efficiency rarely announces how much it is rearranging until later. By these measures, and only by these measures, this place could finally be called a city, even if the word felt slightly exaggerated when spoken aloud. A city does not require size. It requires structure. Roads that expect to be used again. Docks that assume return. Laws that anticipate disagreement. Money that assumes tomorrow. By this definition, the settlement qualified, modestly and without enthusiasm. The Lenape world did not vanish. Interaction continued, layered with trade, misunderstanding, and growing imbalance. Familiar paths remained accessible, but with conditions attached. Space that had once been flexible became measured. Movement that had once been assumed now required explanation. These changes arrived not as catastrophe, but as inconvenience, which is often more effective because it does not trigger alarm. At night, the settlement rested easily. Darkness still had authority. Lamps were few. The sky remained visible. People slept, not because they were exhausted by excess, but because tomorrow promised the same work it always had. There was no nightlife to escape into, no noise to outrun. The settlement slept because it was still small enough to do so. Children growing up here learned a different relationship to land. They learned edges, boundaries. The idea that some spaces were watched, recorded, accounted for. Their sense of belonging was already tied to permanence, even if the word itself had not yet been spoken aloud. What is striking looking back is how little anyone here imagined what this place would become. There were no speeches about destiny, no monuments raised to future greatness. The settlement was content to remain useful, stable, and largely unnoticed. It did not try to be important, it simply continued. And that continuation mattered. Because once a place proves that it can repeat itself day after day without collapsing, it becomes difficult to dismiss as temporary. The settlement did not announce its arrival into history. It entered quietly, through habit, through routine, through the unremarkable decision to stay one more season because staying had become easier than leaving. The river continued flowing beside it, unimpressed by names or ownership. The forest retreated slowly, not in fear, but in accommodation. The land did not resist. It adjusted. An adjustment, once accepted, rarely reverses itself. This was not the birth of a great city. It was something far less dramatic and far more durable. A place that had learned how to function, how to organize, how to remember where things belonged. A place that, without insisting on being remembered, had begun to stay. When the name changed, but the city didn't hurry, 1664. In 1664, the city did not wake up as something new. It woke up with a new name. There was no dramatic transformation in the air, no collective gasp from the streets, no moment where buildings straightened their backs and announced loyalty to a different flag. The English arrived, the Dutch left, and the settlement did what it had already learned to do quite well by now. It adjusted without comment. New Amsterdam became New York, largely through paperwork and timing, which is how many important changes prefer to happen. One day the authority was Dutch, the next it was English, and the city itself responded with polite indifference. The docks remained where they were. The streets did not rearrange themselves out of respect. Trade continued because trade rarely cares who is in charge as long as schedules remain intact. For the people living there, the change felt administrative rather than emotional. Laws were revised, names were replaced, accents shifted slightly, but daily life carried on with the same practical concerns. Cargo still needed to be unloaded, accounts still needed to be balanced. Work, as usual, did not wait for politics to finish its announcements. The English did not inherit a grand city. They inherited a small, functional settlement that already knew how to stay put. New York was not impressive in scale. It had not yet learned how to show off. What it had learned, however, was how to connect. The harbor mattered. The position mattered. The fact that ships could arrive, leave, and return again mattered far more than architectural ambition. And so the port began to grow in importance even as the city itself remained modest. New York did not expand outward dramatically. It expanded outward economically. Trade routes stretched across the Atlantic, and the city found itself quietly promoted from local convenience to imperial utility. It was no longer just useful. It was useful to someone much larger. This is where the irony begins to settle in gently. New York became important without becoming big. It did not yet feel like a capital. It did not look like a center of culture. It was not a place people traveled to be inspired. It was a place goods traveled through because they had to. The city functioned as a hinge, connecting colonies to empire, ships to markets, raw materials to profit, while remaining small enough that most residents still knew where the edge of town ended. The English brought with them a broader imperial vision, but they did not immediately impose grandeur. They were practical rulers of practical assets. New York's value lay in its harbor, its access, its position within a growing Atlantic economy. It did not need to be beautiful. It needed to be reliable. Commerce expanded quietly. More ships passed through. More languages were heard. The city became more international without becoming more crowded. Merchants arrived with goods and left with confidence that the port would be there the next time they returned. That expectation alone was worth more than size. And yet, despite this growing importance, New York still slept early. The streets were not buzzing late into the night. There were no theaters demanding attention, no cafes insisting on conversation. Darkness retained authority. The city rested because it was still small enough to do so, and because rest made work easier the next day. If you stood at the docks during this period, you would sense the city's future more than see it. Ships coming from far away carried news, fashions, rumors of distant power. New York listened without reacting too strongly. It absorbed these influences without yet reshaping itself to match them. This was not yet a city that believed it deserved attention. It was content being useful. For the Lenape, the change in rulers did not restore flexibility. The tightening that had begun earlier continued. Empire, regardless of language, prefers clarity over accommodation. Space became more firmly defined, authority more distant, negotiation less personal. The city did not pause to notice this. Empires rarely do. Still, New York did not behave like a conqueror. It behaved like a clerk. It recorded, it transferred, it facilitated, it existed as a node rather than a destination. Its importance grew not because people loved it, but because systems depended on it. That dependence would matter later. For now, it remained subtle. By the end of the 17th century, New York had settled into a strange identity. It was no longer a fragile experiment. It was no longer merely local. But it was also not a grand urban vision. It existed in between, carrying imperial weight with provincial habits. This is the version of New York that history often skips over because it does not fit the myth. Too small to dazzle, too busy to dramatize, too practical to romanticize. And yet this phase mattered deeply, because this is when the city learned how to belong to something larger without yet believing it was the center of anything. It learned how to move goods rather than ideas, how to connect places rather than define itself, how to matter without demanding admiration. The harbor kept working, the streets kept their shape, the city kept its quiet confidence. It did not rush to become important. Importance arrived anyway, attached to trade routes and imperial needs. New York had become an imperial link, not a metropolis, not a symbol, just a place that things passed through. And sometimes that is the most powerful position of all, even if it does not look like much at night when the lamps dim early and the city sleeps without realizing how many distant systems already depend on it. What followed was not transformation but familiarity, Because once New York had learned how to serve an empire, even quietly, it found itself repeating the role with increasing ease, accepting ships, forwarding goods, recording transactions, and sending everything onward again, as if the city itself preferred motion over possession, content to touch importance briefly, and then let it pass through, which made it strangely reliable in a world that was becoming increasingly restless. The port grew busier, though not louder. More vessels arrived, stayed just long enough to matter, then departed again, leaving behind the faint sense that New York was becoming a place people counted on without ever intending to stay attached to. The city did not demand loyalty. It offered convenience. And convenience, it turns out, travels farther than affection. Merchants learned to trust the harbor. Officials learned to trust the paperwork. The empire learned to trust the route. New York earned its position not by asking for it, but by not failing when called upon, which is perhaps the least glamorous way to become essential. There were no grand announcements marking this shift. It happened gradually, the way habits form, until one day the city simply found itself included in plans that stretched far beyond its own streets. Still, life on the ground remained modest. Houses stayed low, streets stayed narrow. The city did not yet feel crowded enough to hurry. People moved with purpose, not panic. Even commerce had a measured pace, shaped by tides and weather rather than urgency. There was time to wait. Waiting was part of the job. Social life reflected this restraint. Gatherings were practical, conversations brief, entertainment limited. New York did not yet perform itself. It did not need to. Its value lay elsewhere. The city was learning that being dependable was often more profitable than being impressive, a lesson that would quietly shape its character for centuries. If there was humor in all this, it lived in the contrast. A city increasingly tied to global trade still looked, from the outside, like a place you could walk across without effort. An imperial link that closed its doors early. A hub that went to bed on time. New York carried global significance by day and local habits by night, unaware that this imbalance would one day disappear. For those displaced by the city's steady expansion, the change continued to feel less like invasion and more like inevitability. Space that once flexed now held firm. Authority grew more abstract. The city did not notice this shift as loss. It noticed it as order. Empires tend to prefer that interpretation. By the end of this period, New York had become something slightly uncomfortable to define, too small to call a metropolis, too important to dismiss as provincial. It existed as infrastructure rather than idea, a piece of a larger system rather than a destination in its own right. And that is where it rested for a while, a city that did not yet believe in its own future, but was already being woven into futures far beyond its control. The harbor continued its work. Trade flowed. Names changed less often now. The city remained quiet enough to sleep through its own rise, unaware that usefulness, once proven, rarely stays modest for long. By the time the century leaned toward its close, New York had settled into a role it never formally accepted but performed anyway, becoming useful in ways that did not require confidence or vision, only consistency. And this consistency shaped the city more deeply than ambition ever could, because it taught the place that survival did not depend on being admired, only on being dependable, a lesson learned slowly through repeated days that looked much the same: unloading cargo, recording movement, closing doors, opening them again, and trusting that the system would continue because it had already continued long enough to feel normal. The empire valued New York precisely because it did not demand attention. It did not argue for status. It did not need constant reinforcement. It functioned. Goods moved through it. Information passed across it. Authority rested on it without needing ceremony. The city existed as a quiet mechanism, one that worked best when left alone, which suited everyone involved, except perhaps those whose lives were gradually narrowed by the order such mechanisms impose. On the ground, the city still felt modest. You could stand at the edge of town and know where the edge was. You could walk from one end to the other without effort. The harbor was active but not overwhelming. The streets were busy but not crowded. New York had not yet learned how to overwhelm itself. At night, the city remained obedient to darkness. Lamps dimmed early, sounds softened quickly. There was no sense that anything important was happening after hours, and that belief allowed the city to rest without anxiety. Tomorrow would bring ships, paperwork, trade. Tonight belonged to quiet. This version of New York did not imagine itself as a symbol. It did not perform greatness. It did not rehearse a future it could not yet see. It existed within limits and seemed comfortable there, unaware that limits, once tested, tend to invite pressure. The irony, gentle enough to smile at, is that by refusing to behave like a great city, New York was becoming one anyway, just not in ways that announce themselves. It mattered because others relied on it. It endured because it repeated itself. It stayed small in appearance while growing large in consequence. Nothing closed this moment with drama. There was no final declaration, no visible shift. The harbor continued to receive ships. The streets kept their shape. The city went on doing what it had learned to do best, serving without asking to be celebrated. New York had become an imperial link, still modest, still quiet, still unsure of its own significance, carrying the weight of larger systems without yet feeling heavy itself, resting comfortably in a role that felt temporary but was already shaping a future far louder than these early nights could ever imagine. And so the city slept, as it often did, unaware that usefulness, once proven, is rarely allowed to remain small forever. When the city learned to matter without asking, the 18th century. By the 18th century, the city no longer needed to prove that it could stay. That question had quietly resolved itself sometime earlier, without ceremony, without applause. What replaced it was a different, heavier question, one the city did not ask out loud but began answering anyway, which was whether it could be useful at a scale larger than its streets, its docks, and its immediate needs. The answer, delivered slowly and without enthusiasm, turned out to be yes. New York grew not by imagination, but by position. The harbor continued doing most of the work, wide enough to welcome ships that arrived carrying goods, people, and assumptions from far away, and deep enough to send those same things onward, without much delay. Trade moved through the city the way water moves through a narrow channel, not lingering, not admiring the scenery, simply passing along because this was the most efficient route available. The city learned early that movement was more valuable than possession, and this lesson shaped its character more than any ideology ever would. Commerce expanded in ways that did not announce themselves as growth. Warehouses multiplied quietly. Wharves extended a little farther into the water each year. Ledgers thickened, schedules grew denser. The city did not feel larger so much as busier, its days filled with arrivals and departures that rarely belonged to the same people twice. New York became a place defined less by who lived there than by what passed through it. And woven into this movement, often unspoken and deliberately overlooked, was slavery. The city did not build vast plantations, but it benefited deeply from systems that did. Enslaved labor moved through its port. Goods produced by enslaved people were traded, insured, financed, and redistributed here. The city learned how to profit from distance, how to separate cause from consequence, how to treat suffering as an abstraction once it had been converted into cargo and paperwork. This arrangement was not loudly defended. It was quietly normalized, which made it far more durable. By mid-century, New York had become undeniably commercial, though it still resisted the temptation to perform itself as important. It was not Paris. It was not London. It did not cultivate culture as a public spectacle. Its influence came instead from reliability. Ships returned because they trusted the port. Merchants returned because transactions worked. Empires noticed because systems functioned. Then, as empires tend to do, the system began to argue with itself. The American Revolution did not arrive in New York as a single dramatic moment. It arrived as confusion, division, uncertainty about allegiance. The city found itself pulled between loyalties, hosting British forces for much of the conflict, serving as a strategic stronghold rather than a revolutionary stage. This was not where independence was loudly declared. It was where consequences were managed. During the war, New York endured occupation, disruption, and displacement. Fires reshaped parts of the city, trade faltered, then adapted. Life continued, though under conditions that reminded everyone how vulnerable a commercial city can be when the system it depends on begins to fracture. New York did not romanticize this period. It survived it. When the war ended, the city adjusted again, shedding one imperial relationship and stepping cautiously into another, this time as part of a new nation still unsure what it wanted to be. For a brief and slightly awkward moment, New York even served as the nation's capital, hosting the early machinery of American governance with the same restrained practicality it applied to trade. The city did not swell with pride, it accommodated. Being a temporary capital did not transform New York into a symbolic heart. It simply confirmed something the city was beginning to understand about itself. It could hold responsibility without needing to advertise it. It could host power without pretending to embody it. When the capital moved elsewhere, New York did not protest. It returned to work. By the end of the 18th century, the city had acquired something new, something heavier than size or wealth. It had acquired a role, not a personality, not a myth, a function. New York was now a commercial engine, a connector, a place where goods, money, and decisions intersected often enough to matter beyond local concerns. This mattered because roles create expectations. Expectations invite pressure. Pressure over time reshapes places whether they consent or not. Still, the city remained surprisingly restrained. Streets were busier, but not frantic. The harbor was active, but not chaotic. Nights were darker than they would be later. Silence still existed between buildings. The city worked hard by day and slept honestly by night, unaware that rest would eventually become a luxury rather than a habit. If there is humor here, it lies in the contrast. A city increasingly entangled with global commerce still behaved like a place that closed its doors early. A city benefiting from slavery and empire still preferred to think of itself as practical rather than powerful. A city beginning to influence national outcomes still insisted on being modest. But modesty, when paired with position, does not remain harmless for long. As the century closed, New York stood no longer as an experiment, nor merely as an outpost, but as a city with responsibility, a place whose decisions, movements, and failures now rippled outward. It had learned how to matter, not by demanding attention, but by being unavoidable. The harbor kept working. Trade continued, power passed through, and the city, still half asleep to its own significance, settled into the night, unaware that having a role is often the first step toward having expectations that never quite let you rest again. What followed was not celebration, but adjustment, because once a city is given a role, even briefly, it cannot entirely return to pretending it is only passing time. And New York, after hosting power and then watching it move elsewhere, discovered that the experience had left behind a faint but persistent imprint, a sense that things now happened here because they had to, not merely because they could. The streets did not widen overnight. The buildings did not suddenly look more important. But conversations changed. Merchants spoke with more confidence. Decisions carried slightly more weight. The city had learned that it could hold responsibility without collapsing, and that knowledge lingered quietly, shaping expectations long after the capital had gone. Commerce continued to expand, not dramatically, but insistently. Trade routes tightened. Financial habits grew more complex. Credit, insurance, speculation all found comfortable footing in a place already accustomed to thinking in terms of movement and risk. The city did not need to reinvent itself. It simply extended what it already did well. And still New York resisted romance. It did not build its identity around ideals or memory. The revolution became history elsewhere. Here it became logistics. The city had supplied, endured, adapted, and moved on. If independence was a story, New York treated it as infrastructure, something to be maintained rather than performed. Slavery's shadow did not lift quickly. Even as the new nation spoke of liberty, the city continued to profit from systems that contradicted it, handling goods and capital whose origins were carefully kept at arm's length. This contradiction did not trouble the city enough to stop it. Contradictions rarely do when they are profitable. By the time the century ended, New York was no longer simply a port. It was a mediator, a translator between markets, a place where value changed form, where goods became money, money became influence, and influence quietly reshaped space. The city did not call this power. It called it business. Yet for all this, daily life remained grounded. People still knew their neighborhoods. The edge of town was still visible. Night still arrived with authority. Lamps dimmed, doors closed. The city slept because it could, and because it had not yet learned to monetize exhaustion. This was New York at the moment just before acceleration. A city with a role, but not yet an appetite, with responsibility, but not yet ambition large enough to outrun its own streets. It stood balanced between usefulness and desire, unaware that usefulness, once proven, tends to invite more demands than any city expects. The harbor continued receiving ships. The ledgers continued filling. The city continued repeating itself with enough confidence to feel permanent, but not enough awareness to feel dangerous. And as the 18th century quietly stepped aside, New York rested in the dark, carrying trade, contradiction, and consequence, with practiced calm, not yet knowing that the next century would ask it to do all of this faster, louder, and with far less opportunity to sleep. By the time the 18th century began to loosen its grip, New York had grown accustomed to being necessary, and necessity, once accepted, has a way of settling into a place more deeply than pride ever could, because the city no longer needed to imagine importance when importance kept arriving daily in the form of ships, cargo, contracts, and decisions that did not ask permission before passing through its streets. The harbor continued to work without interruption. Goods arrived, were sorted, recorded, and sent onward again. The city did not cling to them. It rarely even looked back. Movement itself had become the point, and New York was becoming very good at facilitating motion without asking where it ultimately led. This skill, learned slowly over decades, now felt instinctive. The contradictions of the age remained unresolved. Liberty was discussed loudly while slavery continued quietly. Commerce expanded while inequality settled deeper into the ground. The city did not attempt to reconcile these tensions. It learned instead how to operate within them, compartmentalizing discomfort the way it compartmentalized cargo, storing certain truths out of sight so that the machinery could continue running smoothly. Political power passed briefly through the city and then moved on, leaving behind no bitterness, only confirmation. New York did not need to be the capital to feel relevant. It had learned that influence could exist without ceremony, that decisions made elsewhere often depended on systems that quietly flowed through its port. Hosting authority had not transformed the city. Losing it did not diminish it either. Daily life remained surprisingly grounded. Neighborhoods retained their shape. People still recognized familiar faces. The city was busy, but not yet overwhelming. There were pauses between moments, silence between buildings, darkness that still belonged to the night rather than to commerce. What had changed was less visible, but more enduring. New York now carried expectations. Merchants expected efficiency. Governments expected reliability. Markets expected continuity. The city was no longer simply a place where things happened to pass through. It was a place that things assumed would be there tomorrow. This expectation gave the city weight. It had not become grand. It had not become beautiful. It had not yet become relentless. But it had become necessary. And necessity is often the most demanding role of all, because it rarely comes with applause, only with increasing responsibility. As the century closed, New York stood as a commercial city with a role firmly in place, a city that had learned how to matter without ever fully deciding whether it wanted to. It had survived empire, war, and transition by doing what it always did best, adapting quietly, continuing steadily, refusing to dramatize its own importance. The harbor kept receiving ships. The ledgers kept filling. The streets kept their familiar bends. The city continued to sleep when the work was done, unaware that the next century would test just how long a city could remain both useful and restrained. For now, though, New York rested, carrying trade, power, and contradiction with practiced calm, a city that had found its place in the world not by declaring it, but by becoming impossible to ignore. And that, without celebration or warning, was how the city finished learning its role. When the city stopped growing and started accelerating. At the beginning of the 19th century, New York did not suddenly decide to become large. It simply stopped being able to remain small. The change did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as pressure. More people than before. More ships than expected. More noise, more movement, more waiting compressed into the same narrow streets that had once felt comfortably sufficient. The city had not planned this. It had merely made itself useful, and usefulness, once proven, tends to attract company. Between 1800 and 1840, the population swelled with a speed that would have startled anyone who still remembered when the edge of town was easy to point out. Immigrants arrived, not because New York promised beauty or ease, but because it promised passage. This was the city you came through to reach something else, and many stayed simply because moving again required resources they no longer had. The city did not welcome them with ceremony. It absorbed them with efficiency. Languages multiplied, accents layered over one another. Neighborhoods thickened. Buildings grew taller not out of ambition but necessity. Space began to feel negotiable rather than abundant. The city's earlier patience thinned, replaced by momentum that did not ask whether everyone could keep up. Still, New York did not imagine itself as a national engine yet. It thought of itself as busy. Commerce expanded beyond the scale of habit. Trade no longer flowed only outward across the Atlantic. It began moving inland, pulled by markets, farms, and resources that needed a reliable exit. The city's role shifted subtly, from a port serving distant empires to a gateway serving a growing country that was still inventing itself. Then, in 1825, the geography of the nation quietly bent toward New York. The opening of the Erie Canal did not look dramatic at first glance. A long, narrow cut of water stretching westward, connecting the city to interior lands that had once felt distant and inconvenient. But canals do not announce their consequences loudly. They whisper them into ledgers, freight schedules, and price differences that slowly reshape entire economies. With the canal open, goods from the interior flowed toward New York more easily than anywhere else. Grain, timber, raw materials moved east. Manufactured goods moved west. The city became the hinge between production and consumption, between rural labor and global markets. Distance collapsed. Time shortened. New York found itself at the center of motion that did not pause long enough to admire the view. This was the moment when the city crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer merely participating in trade. It was organizing it. Warehouses multiplied. Docks stretched farther. Financial institutions thickened, offering credit, insurance, and speculation to manage risks that now extended far beyond the harbor. Money moved faster than goods. Decisions made in offices near the water rippled hundreds of miles inland. New York was becoming an engine. Engines, however, are not known for subtlety. The pace of life quickened. Workdays lengthened. Neighborhoods grew crowded. The city began to feel less like a collection of routines and more like a machine that expected continuous input. Immigrants provided labor. Capital provided direction. The city provided connection. Together, they produced momentum that was difficult to slow, even if slowing might have been wise. Inequality deepened alongside growth. Opportunity and hardship arrived together, often on the same ship. Some fortunes expanded quickly. Others vanished just as fast. The city did not resolve these tensions. It incorporated them. Engines are not built to be fair. They are built to move. And yet, even as New York accelerated, traces of its earlier restraint lingered. The streets were still narrow, infrastructure lagged behind ambition. Water, sanitation, housing strained under numbers they had not been designed to support. The city was growing faster than it could fully understand itself. At night, darkness still fell, but sleep became lighter. Noise traveled farther. Crowds lingered longer. The city had not yet learned how to rest properly under this new weight. It was learning instead how to run. By 1840, New York was no longer just a city that mattered. It was a city that powered things beyond its own borders. Its port fed the nation. Its markets influenced prices far inland. Its failures could ripple outward just as easily as its successes. The transformation was not announced with fanfare. There was no moment when the city declared itself the economic heart of the country. It simply behaved like one long enough that everyone else adjusted accordingly. From port to gateway, from gateway to engine. New York did not choose this role. It arrived by accumulation, by connection, by refusing to break under pressure that would have crushed something less adaptable. The city had stopped merely growing. It had begun accelerating. And acceleration, once started, rarely asks whether the ground beneath it is ready. What changed most visibly was not the skyline, which was still modest by later standards, but the tempo of everything beneath it, because New York had begun to operate on expectations that extended far beyond its own streets. And once a city becomes responsible for moving a nation's goods, it inherits the nation's impatience as well, a quality that does not sleep easily and does not tolerate delay with much grace. The canal did more than redirect cargo. It rearranged trust. Farmers inland trusted New York to sell what they could not move themselves. Manufacturers trusted it to distribute what they could not store. Investors trusted it to calculate risks that were now spread across hundreds of miles. Trust accumulated here the way goods once had, quietly, densely, until the city felt heavier without looking much larger. Immigration fed this momentum relentlessly. People arrived with skills, desperation, hope, exhaustion, sometimes all at once, and the city did not pause to sort them gently. It assigned roles quickly. Labor went where labor was needed. Housing filled wherever it could. Entire neighborhoods formed not out of planning, but out of proximity and necessity. The city did not ask who was ready. It assumed everyone would adapt. Adaptation became the city's defining skill. Work organized daily life more tightly than seasons ever had. Time fractured into shifts, wages, deadlines. The old rhythm of arrival and departure at the docks expanded inland, echoing through markets, factories, and workshops. Waiting was no longer idle. Waiting had to be productive. Even rest began to feel like preparation. The city's humor, if it had one, grew sharper. People joked about crowding, about noise, about how quickly the city swallowed newcomers and expected them to run immediately. There was irony in how a place built on movement now rarely allowed people to stop moving. New York had become very good at offering opportunity without comfort. Financial systems thickened alongside physical ones. Banks, insurers, and brokers multiplied to manage the risks of speed. Credit made growth possible. Debt made it unavoidable. Decisions made near the harbor could now reshape distant towns, fields, and livelihoods that the city would never see. Power had become abstract, which made it easier to exercise and harder to question. And still, New York did not declare itself anything special. It did not hold ceremonies for becoming indispensable. It did not pause to reflect on the consequences of being the nation's gateway. It simply continued doing what engines do best, converting input into output with increasing efficiency and decreasing patience. The costs of this acceleration were visible, but rarely addressed directly. Overcrowding strained housing. Sanitation lagged. Infrastructure groaned. The city learned to tolerate discomfort as long as movement continued. Problems were deferred rather than solved, postponed rather than prevented. Momentum became its own justification. By the late 1830s, New York no longer resembled the port city it had once been. It was a system layered and interdependent, capable of sustaining growth, but increasingly incapable of slowing itself. The canal, the port, the population, the markets, all pulled in the same direction, forward, faster, louder. This was the moment when the city crossed from growth into dependence on growth. Stopping was no longer an option anyone seriously considered. Too many livelihoods, investments, and expectations were tied to continued expansion. The engine could not be turned off without consequences that felt unthinkable. At night, the city still darkened, but sleep came unevenly. Noise lingered. Light lasted longer. The sense of urgency did not fully retreat with the sun. New York was learning, slowly and somewhat unwillingly, that engines are allowed to rest only briefly before being asked to start again. By 1840, the transformation was complete, even if no one marked it clearly. New York had become the economic gateway of the United States, the place where inland ambition met global exchange, where national growth passed through narrow streets and crowded docks before dispersing outward again. The city had not just grown larger, it had become necessary at a scale that made restraint difficult and reflection inconvenient. It had moved from being a port that mattered to an engine that powered others, and engines, once relied upon, are rarely forgiven for slowing down. New York continued forward, carrying the weight of a nation's movement with practiced determination, unaware that acceleration, once normalized, would define not only its future, but the kind of city it was no longer able to refuse becoming. By the time the early decades of the 19th century drew to a close, New York had learned something quietly irreversible, which was that its future was no longer determined by what it wanted, but by what depended on it. And dependence has a way of tightening its grip without ever raising its voice, because once farms, factories, investors, and entire regions began organizing their expectations around the city's ability to move goods and capital. New York ceased to be merely a place where growth happened and became instead a condition that growth assumed. The canal continued its work without celebration. Barges moved steadily, prices adjusted. Distances shrank on paper and in practice. The city did not need to advertise its importance. It appeared in freight schedules, in account books, in the quiet confidence of people who sent things toward New York, without asking whether another route might be better. Trust had settled here, and trust, once earned, rarely migrates easily. Daily life adapted to this weight unevenly. Some thrived in the expanding web of opportunity. Others were compressed by it, packed into neighborhoods that filled faster than they could be cared for. The city did not stop to reconcile these outcomes. It learned instead how to contain them side by side, prosperity and strain occupying the same streets without acknowledging one another directly. Infrastructure struggled to keep pace. Water, waste, housing, and health lagged behind ambition. The city responded not with pause, but with improvisation. Problems were managed just well enough to allow movement to continue. The logic was simple, if unspoken. Stopping would be worse. New York had become skilled at living with consequences before fully understanding their causes. And yet, despite the acceleration, there were moments when the older city could still be felt beneath the noise. In the early morning, before the day fully assembled itself, the harbor still breathed quietly. The river still moved with its own patience. The streets, briefly empty, hinted at a time when the city had not yet learned to hurry. Those moments did not last long. By 1840, the transformation was undeniable. New York was no longer simply a city that traded with the world. It was a city through which the nation traded with itself. Inland ambition, coastal exchange, and global markets now converged here with such regularity that the city's failure was no longer imaginable. Too much depended on it working tomorrow. This realization did not inspire pride. It inspired obligation. The city carried that obligation forward without ceremony, without asking whether it was prepared for what would follow. It continued expanding, adjusting, improvising, because engines do not stop to reflect on their design while they are in use. They respond to demand. And demand was growing. As the chapter closes, New York does not stand triumphant or resolved. It stands engaged, committed, already leaning into a future that will ask more of it than this century has yet revealed. The port still works, the canal still feeds it, the people still arrive, the city still runs. It has become the engine of a nation, not because it declared itself so, but because too many paths now run through it to imagine another arrangement. And in the quiet moments between shifts, when the lamps dim and the noise softens but does not fully disappear, the city rests just long enough to gather itself, unaware that acceleration, once normalized, rarely loosens its hold, and that the next phase will demand not just speed, but endurance of a kind New York has only just begun to understand. When the city began to outrun its own body. By the middle of the 19th century, New York had become very good at moving forward and increasingly bad at noticing how tired it was, because growth had stopped feeling like a choice and started behaving more like momentum, the kind that carries everything with it whether it is ready or not, including people, buildings, and systems that were never designed to move at this speed for this long. The population continued to rise, but now it pressed inward rather than outward. Space grew expensive before it grew sufficient. Houses filled, then refilled, then subdivided again, not because anyone thought it was wise, but because people kept arriving and the city had not learned how to say no without collapsing. Buildings grew taller in narrow increments. Rooms multiplied inside walls that had already been stretched thin. Privacy became a memory rather than an expectation. This was the age of the tenement. Tenements did not arrive as a mistake. They arrived as a solution, a deeply efficient, deeply imperfect solution to the problem of too many people and too little space. Families stacked on top of one another, sharing light, air, and often very little of either. Windows faced walls, courtyards shrank until they became jokes. The city learned how to house bodies without necessarily supporting lives. Work was plentiful. Dignity was not. Factories, workshops, docks, and construction sites absorbed labor endlessly. Immigrants, children, women, men worked long hours for wages that disappeared quickly into rent, food, and survival. The city did not hide this arrangement. It normalized it. Poverty became part of the scenery, as familiar as brick and smoke, as expected as noise. Infrastructure lagged badly, streets struggled to handle traffic that never paused, waste piled faster than it could be removed, water systems were unreliable, uneven, and often unsafe. Disease moved through neighborhoods with efficiency that mirrored commerce. The city responded not with prevention, but with endurance. People adapted because they had no alternative. There was still no electricity to soften the night. Gaslight flickered unevenly, leaving large sections of the city dim and uncertain after dark. Water had to be hauled, stored, shared. Clean water was not a guarantee, it was a privilege, and cooling in summer remained a matter of luck, shade, and patience. The city grew denser without growing more comfortable. Heat lingered. Smells accumulated. Noise refused to fade. The city's sensory load intensified while its ability to relieve that load remained limited. People learned to live with discomfort the way they learned to live with crowds, accepting it as the price of proximity to opportunity. And yet there was a strange resilience here. Despite the strain, the city did not fracture. It bent. Communities formed inside tenements. Networks of support emerged where systems failed. Humor survived, sharp and self-aware, often directed at the city itself, because laughing at overcrowding, exhaustion, and filth was sometimes the only way to avoid being swallowed by them. The city, for its part, continued expanding economically, even as its physical systems protested. Capital flowed, industry grew, buildings rose. New York did not slow down to match its infrastructure. It expected infrastructure to catch up eventually, a belief that would define much of its future. This period exposed a fundamental imbalance. The city's ambitions had outpaced its capacity to care for the people making those ambitions possible. Growth was rewarded, maintenance was deferred. The result was a city that functioned impressively on paper and struggled profoundly on the ground. Still, nights came. After long days of labor, people returned to rooms that barely fit them. Windows were opened when possible. Fire escapes became sleeping spaces. Roofs became refuges. The city did not rest easily, but it rested when it had to. Tomorrow would demand more. By 1870, New York had become unmistakably urban, but not yet humane. It was a city powered by bodies that were asked to endure more than the systems around them could support. It lived faster than its capacity to heal, faster than its ability to provide comfort, faster than its infrastructure could reasonably sustain. This was the cost of acceleration without restraint. The city had learned how to grow. It had not yet learned how to care for itself. And so it continued forward, crowded, strained, restless, carrying opportunity and exhaustion in equal measure, a city that had begun to live faster than its own ability to breathe, unaware that the next question history would ask was not how much it could grow, but how long it could survive at this pace without breaking. What made this period especially difficult was not that hardship existed, but that it became routine. Because once discomfort repeats itself often enough, it stops feeling temporary and begins to feel like a condition of life. And New York, by the 1850s and 1860s, had quietly trained large parts of its population to expect crowding, noise, heat, and fatigue as the baseline rather than the exception. Tenement life compressed everything. Sound traveled through thin walls without permission. Privacy dissolved into schedules and shared corners. Air moved reluctantly, filtered through courtyards that barely deserved the name. In summer, heat settled into rooms and refused to leave. In winter, cold crept in, wherever walls were weakest. The city offered shelter, but rarely comfort, and people learned to negotiate with their environment constantly, adjusting routines, sleeping patterns, and expectations simply to get through the day. Labor followed a similar pattern of compression. Work days stretched long enough to erase the boundary between effort and exhaustion. Factories demanded regularity from bodies that were already strained by poor housing and unreliable nutrition. Children worked because families needed income. Women worked because households could not survive on one wage. Men worked because there was always someone else willing to take their place, if they did not. The city did not question this logic. It depended on it. Infrastructure, meanwhile, struggled visibly. Streets flooded when rain fell too hard. Waste lingered where systems failed to collect it. Disease traveled along the same paths as commerce, moving efficiently through crowded neighborhoods where clean water was inconsistent and medical care was uneven at best. Cholera, tuberculosis, and other illnesses did not shock the city anymore. They circulated like rumors, expected and feared, but rarely prevented. Still, electricity remained largely absent. Gaslight illuminated select streets and districts, leaving others in shadow. Night brought a different kind of congestion as people spilled into shared spaces seeking air, conversation, or simply a break from the press of interior rooms. Fire escapes became extensions of living space. Rooftops offered relief. The city adapted vertically because it had no horizontal room left to negotiate with. And cooling when summer arrived was improvised rather than engineered. Shade mattered, water mattered, breeze mattered. People learned the geography of comfort the way they learned the geography of work, memorizing which stoops caught wind, which alleys stayed cooler, which hours were bearable. The city provided no universal relief. It offered fragments, and people assembled those fragments into survival. There was humor in this, though it was rarely gentle. Jokes about crowding, about smells, about noise circulated freely because acknowledging absurdity was easier than acknowledging despair. The city developed a sharp, self-aware wit, one that laughed at its own excesses even while being crushed by them. This humor did not fix anything. It made endurance possible. What is striking is how little of this slowed the city's economic momentum. Trade continued, industry expanded, capital accumulated. New York grew richer, even as many of its residents grew more strained. The city learned how to separate prosperity from well-being, a skill that would prove disturbingly useful in later decades. By the late 1860s, New York had become a place of extremes layered tightly together. Wealth and poverty occupied neighboring streets. Opportunity and exploitation shared the same buildings. Progress was visible in statistics and invisible in daily comfort. The city's systems rewarded speed, output, and growth while postponing care, maintenance, and repair. And yet the city did not collapse. It continued because people continued. Communities formed in narrow spaces. Mutual aid emerged where institutions failed. People adapted not because conditions were acceptable, but because survival required creativity. The city lived on borrowed resilience, drawn from bodies that were asked to carry more than they should have. As this period drew toward its close, New York stood as a fully urban place, unmistakably powerful and unmistakably strained. It had outpaced its own capacity to absorb growth comfortably. It had learned how to demand endurance before learning how to provide relief. This was a city living faster than its ability to recover, faster than its infrastructure could support, faster than its people could reasonably rest. It was no longer just crowded. It was saturated, and yet night still arrived. Windows opened, voices softened, bodies found rest where they could. The city did not sleep deeply, but it slept enough to continue. Tomorrow would bring more work, more movement, more pressure. New York had learned how to survive acceleration. It had not yet learned how to slow down. And that unresolved tension between motion and care would shape everything that followed, because a city that learns to endure without relief eventually has to confront a harder question than growth ever posed, which is how long endurance can last before something gives way. When the city learned how to shine and how to hide, 1870 and after. By 1870, New York no longer needed to prove that it could endure. It had already done that. What it began to experiment with instead was visibility, the careful, selective act of shining just enough to be admired while keeping its exhaustion discreetly out of view. Because this was the age when the city learned that appearance could move faster than repair, and that spectacle could distract from strain long enough to feel like progress. This was the beginning of the Gilded Age, though the city itself did not announce it that way. Gold does not usually introduce itself. It simply starts appearing on surfaces. Buildings grew taller and more confident. Institutions grew richer and louder. Industry expanded until smoke became a familiar companion to the skyline. New York became unmistakably industrial, not only producing goods but producing scale. Factories hummed, rail lines tightened their grip, finance thickened into a system that could move money faster than bodies. Banks, brokers, insurers, and speculators clustered together, turning paper into power with a speed that felt almost magical if you benefited from it, and abstract if you did not. The city became a place where wealth could grow without ever touching the ground, and grow it did. The rich did not merely become wealthy, they became extremely wealthy, to the point where money stopped being a tool and started becoming architecture. Mansions rose along avenues, interiors glittered. Consumption itself became a language, spoken fluently by those who could afford to forget where the city's pressure came from. Comfort became expansive, intentional, designed. At the same time, poverty did not retreat. It condensed. The poor remained packed into tenements, now pressed even harder by rising rents and rising expectations. The distance between wealth and poverty shrank physically while expanding socially. A short walk could take you from chandeliers to shared toilets, from carriages to barefoot children, from rooms designed for display to rooms designed only to hold bodies overnight. The city learned how to contain extremes without reconciling them. This contrast became one of New York's defining features, not merely inequality but proximity, wealth and hardship occupying adjacent blocks, sometimes adjacent buildings, rarely acknowledging one another directly. The city did not hide this contradiction. It normalized it. It allowed both to exist simultaneously, trusting that motion would prevent reflection. Urban life itself became a subject for the first time. People began writing about the city not just as a place where things happened, but as a condition. Journalists described crowding, noise, ambition, excess. Reformers documented housing, labor, sanitation. Novelists and observers turned daily life into narrative, fascinated by how the city compressed human experience into such tight spaces. The city was no longer just functioning. It was being watched. And watching changed things. The idea of urban life emerged as something distinct, something worth examining, criticizing, even dramatizing. The city began to see itself reflected back through descriptions of its streets, its workers, its elites, its contradictions. New York started becoming self-aware, though not yet self-correcting. Infrastructure improved unevenly. Some neighborhoods gained better lighting, transportation, and services. Others remained neglected. Progress arrived selectively, following money rather than need. The city shined where it expected to be seen and strained quietly where it did not. There was irony in how confidently New York embraced its industrial and financial identity while still relying on systems that pushed human endurance to its limits. The city celebrated efficiency while exhausting labor. It praised innovation while delaying care. It admired growth while postponing repair. And yet there was excitement here, too. Opportunity still pulled people in. The promise of upward movement, however narrow, kept the city humming. New York became a place where futures felt possible, even if they were improbable. That tension between hope and reality energized the city, giving it a restless edge that was new, sharper, less patient than before. At night, the city began to glow differently. Gaslight spread. Certain districts stayed awake longer. Entertainment expanded. The night started to feel less like rest and more like extension. Sleep shortened. Noise lingered. The city learned how to stretch the day beyond necessity. This was the moment New York became unmistakably modern. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was fair, but because it was complex, layered, contradictory, and increasingly conscious of itself as a city. The Gilded Age did not fix New York's problems. It reframed them. It taught the city how to display success while containing strain, how to shine while deferring balance. The gold was real but thin, applied carefully over structures that were still carrying enormous weight. This is the point your story has been moving toward. The city no longer just survives, accelerates, or endures. It performs, it displays, it invites admiration and critique in equal measure. Urban life is no longer background. It is the subject. New York has learned how to be seen. And that visibility, once embraced, will make it much harder for the city to pretend it does not know exactly what it is becoming. What changed most quietly was the city's relationship with attention, because once New York learned how to shine, it also learned how to manage where the light fell and where it did not, allowing certain avenues to glitter while other streets remained conveniently dim. A division that felt natural to those who benefited from it and inevitable to those who learned to live in its shadow. Industry deepened its grip. Factories multiplied. Work became louder, faster, more repetitive. Machines set the tempo and people adjusted their bodies accordingly. The city praised productivity while rarely asking what it cost. Output mattered, endurance was assumed. Efficiency became a virtue that excused almost anything, especially if it made money move more smoothly. Finance, meanwhile, grew increasingly abstract. Wealth no longer needed to be visible to be powerful. Paper contracts, stocks, and speculation carried influence that buildings could only suggest. Decisions made in quiet offices traveled outward, shaping labor, housing, and entire neighborhoods without ever introducing themselves. The city learned that power could whisper and still be obeyed. And still, proximity remained New York's defining tension. The wealthy could not fully escape the poor, and the poor could not avoid seeing wealth displayed just close enough to feel intentional. This closeness sharpened awareness. Resentment grew. Curiosity grew. Reform movements emerged alongside extravagance, documenting conditions, counting bodies, measuring air and light, insisting that the city look at what it preferred to step around. Urban life became something to interpret. Newspapers expanded coverage of daily existence, not just events. Writers described tenements, sweatshops, crowded streets, glittering parlors, and sleepless nights. The city's contradictions were no longer private inconveniences. They became material, stories, arguments, evidence. New York began to understand that being watched changes behavior, even if change comes slowly. Infrastructure advanced unevenly but visibly. Transportation improved. Certain neighborhoods brightened. Services expanded where investment justified them. The city did not fix inequality. It organized it more efficiently. Progress followed profit, and the city accepted this as rational, even when it was cruel. At night, the glow intensified. Gaslight stretched farther. Entertainment multiplied. Restaurants, theaters, and gathering places extended the day into hours once reserved for rest. Sleep shortened. The city discovered that being awake longer felt like advancement, even if bodies disagreed. Fatigue became fashionable in certain circles, a sign of importance rather than strain. There was humor here, sharp and knowing. Jokes about excess, about ambition, about how quickly fortunes rose and fell, circulated easily. The city laughed at itself because laughter softened critique and made contradiction feel manageable. Irony became a social skill, and beneath all of this, the older city still existed, compressed but persistent. Tenements remained crowded. Labor remained cheap. Discomfort remained ordinary. The gold did not erase the weight beneath it, it highlighted it by contrast. This period did not resolve anything. It reframed everything. New York had become a metropolis, not simply by size or wealth, but by self-awareness. It knew it was complex. It knew it was unequal. It knew it was powerful. And it learned how to live with that knowledge without letting it slow the machinery. As this chapter settles, the city stands fully visible, illuminated and exposed, admired and criticized, proud and strained at the same time. Urban life is no longer an accident. It is the subject, the spectacle, the argument. New York has learned how to shine. What it has not yet learned is how to soften the light. By the late 19th century, New York had learned how to exist in two versions of itself at the same time, and to treat that contradiction not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be managed, because the city had discovered that it could shine without healing, expand without balancing, and still be admired for the surface it presented to the world. The gold was real, but it was never meant to carry weight. It rested lightly on top of systems that remained strained, crowded, and uneven, and the city learned to apply it carefully to facades, to institutions, to stories it told about itself, while allowing the deeper pressures to remain largely untouched. This was not deception so much as habit. When a city grows fast enough, it learns that repair can always be postponed until later. Urban life, now fully visible, became something people talked about even while living inside it. Crowds, noise, ambition, fatigue, excess, spectacle, inequality, all became familiar enough to be named, categorized, and even aestheticized. The city began to see itself reflected in descriptions, illustrations, editorials, and statistics, and that reflection did not slow it down. It energized it. Wealth continued to accumulate upward, poverty continued to press inward, and the space between them remained physically narrow and socially vast. The city did not pretend this gap did not exist. It simply learned how to walk past it efficiently. Proximity became normal. Contrast became scenery. At night, New York glowed longer than it ever had before. Gaslight softened certain streets. Entertainment extended the day. Sleep became optional in places where money or ambition demanded attention. The city learned how to stay awake without asking whether it should. Rest was no longer a shared rhythm. It became individual, negotiated, uneven. And yet, despite the spectacle, despite the noise, despite the speed, the city still carried the memory of what it had been. Narrow streets still bent where habit had shaped them. Old buildings still held crowded lives. People still opened windows for air, still sought quiet where they could find it, still rested in fragments rather than wholes. This is where the story you are telling truly begins. Not with origins, not with survival, not even with growth, but with awareness. New York had become a metropolis that knew it was one, a city conscious of its power, its inequality, its exhaustion, and its allure, and willing, at least for now, to live inside that tension without resolving it. Urban life was no longer background. It was the subject, the condition, the argument. The Gilded Age did not complete the city. It exposed it. It showed how much New York could carry, how much it could postpone, how brightly it could shine while remaining deeply uneven underneath. The gold caught the eye. The strain remained. As the chapter closes, the city does not rest fully. It dims slightly, just enough to continue. The lights stay on. The noise softens, but does not disappear. Tomorrow promises more movement, more ambition, more contradiction. New York has learned how to be seen. What it will have to learn next is whether being seen is enough, or whether a city that shines this brightly can continue without eventually needing to look inward, slow its breath, and decide what kind of life it is actually building beneath the gold. When the city finally had to breathe. By the time this long story reaches its quiet edge, New York is no longer a question of origins or growth, but a question of endurance, because everything that once arrived here as an experiment, a habit, a convenience, or a necessity has accumulated into something that no longer moves lightly, and the city, for the first time, must reckon not with how fast it can go, but with how long it can keep going without forgetting what rest feels like. The land remembers more than the city often allows itself to notice. Before there were streets, there were paths. Before schedules, there were seasons. Before trade routes, there was water moving at its own pace. Each layer of the city arrived with good reasons and practical intentions, and none of them imagined the weight they would eventually carry together. What began as a place that learned how to stay became a place that learned how to accelerate, then a place that learned how to shine, and finally a place that learned how to live with contradiction without resolving it. That is the quiet arc of New York. It did not become what it is by ambition alone. It became this way by repetition, by choosing efficiency over pause, by allowing usefulness to substitute for reflection, by trusting that tomorrow would absorb the costs of today. And for a very long time, tomorrow did. The city learned early how to survive transition. Empires changed, names changed, economies shifted. The city adapted not by reinventing itself each time, but by keeping its core skill intact, which was movement. Goods moved. Money moved. People moved. Ideas moved just fast enough to feel alive without stopping long enough to feel heavy. That movement built extraordinary power. But power has a rhythm, and when the rhythm never slows, even the strongest systems begin to lose sensitivity. By the time New York entered the Gilded Age, it had learned how to dazzle without healing, how to expand without balancing, how to perform success while postponing care. The gold was not a lie, it was simply thin. Urban life became visible, described, documented, observed. The city saw itself reflected in words and images, and instead of pausing, it leaned into the reflection, fascinated by its own complexity. Crowds became texture, inequality became contrast, exhaustion became background noise, and still people lived. They slept when they could, they adapted when they had to, they found humor where systems failed. They built communities inside spaces never designed to hold them. The city's endurance was never abstract. It lived in bodies, routines, improvisations, and quiet negotiations with discomfort that rarely made it into official narratives. This is the part history often compresses. We talk about growth, industry, finance, progress. We rarely talk about breath, about the accumulated fatigue of living inside a place that never quite stops asking for more, about the way cities borrow resilience from people without always returning it. New York is not unique in this, but it is exceptionally good at it. What makes this city different is not that it grew faster, but that it normalized speed so completely that slowness began to feel like failure. Rest became private, care became conditional, comfort became a marker of success, rather than a shared expectation. And yet, beneath all of this, the older rhythms never fully disappeared. Even now, the river still moves without instruction. Night still arrives, even if the city tries to resist it. Buildings still cast shadows that remind the streets below that light is never permanent. There are moments early in the morning or late at night when the city's pace softens just enough for its original shape to be felt again, a place that once learned how to stay, not how to rush. This is not a call for nostalgia. The past was not gentler. It was simply different in what it demanded. The question New York carries forward is not whether it can continue. It always has. The question is whether continuation alone is enough, or whether a city that has learned to accelerate, perform, and endure might eventually need to relearn how to pause without fearing collapse. Because endurance is not infinite. Cities, like people, can live beyond their limits for surprisingly long stretches of time. They can function while strained. They can shine while uneven. They can adapt to discomfort until discomfort feels ordinary. But eventually something subtle changes. The strain stops being background and starts becoming structure. This is where your story leaves New York. Not at triumph, not at failure, but at awareness. A city that knows it is powerful. A city that knows it is unequal. A city that knows it is tired. And still keeps going because stopping feels unthinkable, even if slowing down might be necessary. New York does not sleep easily anymore. It rests in fragments, in shifts, in private moments carved out between demands. The night is no longer shared. It is negotiated. And yet, night still matters. It still offers a brief return to scale, a reminder that even the largest systems are built from small human needs. This is the quiet truth beneath the skyline. The city was never just buildings or money or speed. It was always a relationship between land, time, and human endurance. Each era added weight. Each solution postponed balance. Each success demanded more resilience than the last. The gold will fade. The systems will change. The city will adapt again. It always does. But what remains, if we listen slowly enough, is the sound beneath the motion, the breath between days, the faint memory of a place that once knew how to exist without hurrying, and the possibility that remembering that rhythm might still matter, not to undo the city, not to escape it, but to make living inside it feel human again. And so the story ends not with an answer, but with a pause, brief and necessary, the kind that allows the city and those who move within it to gather themselves just long enough to continue, not faster, but more aware, carrying history not as weight alone, but as a reminder that even the most relentless places were once quiet enough to hear their own breath. And now the city grows quiet again, not silent, just quieter than it was a moment ago. The streets do not disappear, the lights do not all turn off, the river does not stop moving, but the urgency loosens its grip just enough for the city to feel its own weight, resting instead of pushing forward. New York does not end. It never really does. It simply pauses, between demands, between arrivals, between versions of itself. Everything you have heard in this long night is still there. The land beneath the pavement, the habits beneath the systems, the exhaustion beneath the shine. The city did not forget how it came to be. It simply learned how to carry those memories quietly, layered beneath steel, brick, money, and motion. If there is a lesson here, it is not about success or failure. It is about accumulation, about how small decisions repeat until they feel permanent, about how usefulness turns into obligation, about how endurance becomes identity before anyone realizes what it has replaced. New York did not become restless overnight. It practiced restlessness for centuries. And still, even now, there are moments when the city exhales. Late hours, early mornings, a window left open, a street briefly empty. In those moments, the city remembers that it was once a place that learned how to stay before it learned how to rush. That memory matters, because history does not only live in events, it lives in habits, in rhythms, in the way a city treats sleep, breath, and the space between one day and the next. Tonight, we let the city rest where it can. We let the noise soften. We let the story close without forcing it into an answer. Thank you for staying with this night, for listening slowly, for letting history move at a human pace. Wherever you are and whatever time surrounds you, may this quiet travel with you a little longer. Good night, and welcome back whenever you are ready to listen again.